I was asked to participate, we were kind of kicking around ideas as to what I could talk about that would kind of fit with my research and kind of overlap with the topic of the exhibition. And what I kind of came to was a couple different things. I'm hoping to hit kind of two big themes here. But the first one I want to focus on is on kind of Sports Illustrated, where a lot of these photographs appeared and were for. And look at Sports Illustrated a little bit more closely as an example of how sports media has evolved. And one of my big takeaways as I think about the exhibition and the work here is how it's a product of a unique moment in time where there was investment into long form journalism for sports. There was investment in creative photography. There was resources for sports journalists to go beyond just documenting games in the moment and to create more meaningful pieces of work. And one thing I've encountered in my research and that other sports media scholars have often talked about is how those conditions have kind of eroded a bit with the rise of the internet, social media, and kind of modern media infrastructure. So what I kind of want to do here is kind of trace what's kind of happened in the past 20 years as particularly the rise of the internet has really transformed the media infrastructure of sports media. So there's a couple of themes I want to hit. The first is that in the early 2000s, again, as kind of the internet started gaining popularity, we started to see the rise of a different way of covering sports media, or covering sports, I should say. And we started to see the insertion of more irreverence or not taking sport quite as seriously. The integration of sport with pop culture, often in the same sort of websites, and kind of the rise of kind of the voice of the fan as a legitimate way to cover sports. So we might trace this a bit to actually one of our largest sports media organizations, ESPN, which launched Page 2 in the very early 2000s. And this was kind of a place where they could kind of let their guard down. So ESPN Page 2 was kind of a reference to it being kind of the back page of ESPN. And you can just kind of see from the kind of the layout, it's a little bit more chaotic, it's a little bit more colorful, it's a little bit more playful. There's stuff, articles here about movies. They had more pop culture references. The articles were a little bit more opinionated, a little bit more frivolous at times, and it tried to kind of create a new type of covering sports that appealed to younger people and appealed to people who were looking for something a little less kind of stodgy than what we might say was traditional sports journalism. The big moment, I would argue, happened after the launch of Page 2. So Page 2 kind of came from an established sports media company, ESPN, but the internet also started to allow anyone to kind of create web pages and blogs and things like that. And the kind of the big one that kind of emerged that really disrupted the entire industry was Deadspin. How many people here have heard of Deadspin? It's kind of faded out of relevance these days, but it was a big deal in the mid 2000s when it came along. And what it was a sports blog that was unafraid to trade in gossip and rumors around sports, unafraid to speak really frankly and crudely about other people in sports and sports media, unafraid to share pictures of athletes who were out partying and drank too much and someone took embarrassing pictures of them. Right? Maybe a way to think about it is similar to kind of how TMZ is these days, as a site unafraid to go there to the places where traditional sports media wouldn't. So what I want to show is what I think is a really great historical artifact of the mainstream sports media kind of grappling with the arrival of Deadspin as this kind of outsider blog that really disrupted the media industry. So this is a clip from the show On the Record with Bob Costas. Bob Costas is kind of an elder statesman of sports journalism. He's been around for a very long time. And he had a show where he took on serious topics within sports. So yeah, entire episode dedicated to the rise of Deadspin. So I'm going to show kind of the first little package he put together about it, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. And the quality is really bad because this is just what TV looked like back then.
Instant scores and constant updates. Any stat that's ever been computed. Highlights, breakdowns, and analysis of every game from thousands of writers in hundreds of cities. What sports fan could complain about that? But there's also this, the Wild West of the internet, the blogosphere, a virtual bulletin board where anyone can post anything, opinions, photos, videos, all blurring the lines between news and gossip, truth and rumor, commentary and insult. Among the most popular blogs is Deadspin.com, which boasts sports news without access, favor, or discretion as its motto. If you're a famous athlete, you don't want to end up on Deadspin, especially if you were out drinking the night before. The site gets 10 million hits a month. Will Leach is its 32-year-old founder.
If something's true and something is valid and something is worthwhile doing, I will do it. But I think that gets confused sometime with, all right, what can I dig up on somebody? Like, that's not what it is at all. It's just a matter of, like, if something is newsworthy enough, it will be covered. And sometimes those things are not necessarily PG.
Will Leach is unapologetically a fan, in his case, of the St. Louis Cardinals. Just go to Deadspin and read all about it.
One of the fundamental principles of journalism is honesty and forthrightness. And I think if I pretended that I did not have my own viewpoints and I did not have my own biases, I'm not sure how that's being more truthful to the reader. I've never quite understood the idea that, like, well, now I'm a journalist, so now I cheer for no team. Really? Why'd you get into sports in the first place?
The average person would rather read someone like Bill Simmons and a list of details about the game. I mean, that information is no longer received from newspapers. That information you get on an ESPN ticker, or you get on the internet, or you get on XM radio, or whatever.
If you're really waiting to read the game story in the newspaper to find out what happened in the Cardinals game last night, you're probably over the age of 50.
I have producers. They're 40 years old. They're incredibly well-educated. They're incredibly informed. They don't care about newspapers, and that depresses the hell out of me.
And the revolution that's taking place can be unsettling. If younger fans don't appreciate real credentials and inside access, what's the future of newspaper coverage and sports journalism? The new wave doesn't appear concerned.
Anytime someone does something new or something a little bit different, everyone's like, that's not really journalism. That's not really what we do. But it's just not what you do.
Okay, joining us now at our round.
Okay, I'm stopping here. So it actually leads into a roundtable where Bob Costas has Will Leach on, the founder of Deadspin, along with Buzz Bissinger, who's a famous traditional sports journalist. And they argue about this topic for like a good 15 minutes. And actually got a lot of media coverage at the time because Buzz Bissinger goes off, like he gets really crazy about it. So if you're interested in this topic, go on YouTube at some point, look it up. It's very fascinating. It's really a look into the moment where sports journalism was confronted with the arrival of a new type of a way of covering sports that came from the outside, right? Kind of the outsider perspective. And this has kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of successful sports media outlets, right? So we have Deadspin here. People are probably much more familiar with Barstool, right? Which has a lot of cultural relevancy. John Boy Media, another one that I see a lot of younger people really into. Even though it says ESPN here, Bill Simmons was kind of the typical voice of the fan. He really pioneered that kind of concept at ESPN, but eventually got him fired because he was very critical of NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell. He got suspended from ESPN. One thing led to another. He eventually left and started The Ringer, which is still around these days and does the same kind of voice of the fan, pop culture, not taking itself kind of seriously. So in some ways, this is, I wouldn't necessarily say the dominant model in sports media coverage, but it's a new one. It's from the internet and it is sustainable and successful. At the same time, the traditional model has kind of fallen apart a little bit. And we can kind of read the evolution of Sports Illustrated through this larger lens of the crisis of journalism. right? Most people probably in here do not read a newspaper on a daily basis, right? Newspapers have taken a really hard hit. Magazines as well, pretty much don't exist anymore. These traditional models of doing journalism, of which Sports Illustrated was really a part of, have not translated well to the internet outside of a couple rare exceptions like the New York Times and maybe a couple other places. So Sports Illustrated then got kind of sucked into what's happened to a lot of newspapers and a lot of traditional journalistic outlets, where they started to get sold and passed around to a lot of different owners. So Sports Illustrated was founded in 1954 by Time, sort of the biggest magazine in the US, its own kind of media conglomerate, really important in the US media landscape. Time eventually, when we got to 2000, merged with Warner Media to form Time Warner. And this was an attempt to create a new type of media company that was connected to the internet, to the mass media, film and television, and to the print media. It was really ambitious for the time, probably our first kind of early internet-driven media merger, and it totally flopped and failed. And eventually Time was kind of spun off into its own company again and kind of started to circle the drain a little bit, had a really rough go of it, eventually sold off Sports Illustrated in 2018. It eventually ended up in the hands of Authentic Brands Group, which is this larger company that is not really a media publisher as much as it is a company that leverages the brands of kind of legacy companies, right? It's kind of where companies go to die in a sense, and to kind of make money off of what they used to do. So Authentic Brands Group then sold the publishing rights to Maven in 2019. And then there was just another recent change, which I'll get into. So when Sports Illustrated had its publishing rights sold to Maven, Maven effectively took control of the company. They did what we've seen happen to a lot of newspapers and journalistic outlets and magazines that have been sold in the internet age. They laid off a ton of people. This just happens routinely in the news, the journalism industry these days. Even to this day, if you're following journalistic news, layoffs are just a common occurrence. And the discourse around this was interesting. The new owners, Maven, said that they're trying to save the magazine. The staffers say they're kind of ruining it. And the important thing here is that Maven kind of represents a new model of content creation that we see a lot on the internet. And that's to kind of offload the work of content creation to others, right? Particularly people that you aren't paying or paying that much. So you can see their little tagline here. They're a coalition of curated independent content. You don't need to read this. This is a lot of PR speak. But basically what they started to do was they started recruiting an army of freelancers to replace the salaried Sports Illustrated writers, kind of the longtime journalists. Right? And basically kind of stripping the magazine of the original reporting, right? And then just using it to have fans and freelancers create content for it. Eventually, they kind of had their strategy slide deck leaked, and they kind of laid it out. So at the very top, they just have a couple editors. And then beyond that, their content is coming from partnerships, sponsored content, and then having expert contributors, which would not be journalists that they're paying, but celebrities, fans, other people like that. This was a model that we were already seeing in sports media. Another big fan site, it's not as big now, but it was very big for a while, was SB Nation, which again, did not employ that many full-time writers, did not produce much original content on its own, but it got a lot of revenue because it had basically a website for every single team that had people running it and writing articles about it who were all doing it for free, right? It was basically user-generated content. And they built an entire company based on that. And actually Deadspin, the company I talked about before, they actually wrote kind of a big expose about it that brought a lot of attention to it. This type of strategy is, again, commonplace in kind of legacy print media as people have come in to try to revitalize it. So the head of Sports Illustrated, Ross Levinson, was also at one point tasked with bringing the Los Angeles Times, one of the biggest newspapers in the country, into the digital age. And there he kind of deployed the same type of strategy, right, as pointed out by the LA Times guild there, right, of trying to fire reporters and then to offload the work of creating content for the newspaper to volunteers. And this is kind of from the strategy slide deck for Tronc, the company that owned LA Times. Again, there's a lot of PR speak here, but you can kind of see the same thing. You have a small number of people at the top, that's the newsroom, and then most of the content is coming from contributors, again, who don't necessarily have to be paid. So kind of the unfortunate reality of the modern media landscape is that it's very hard to make money. And if it's hard to make money, it's hard to pay people for journalism, right? Especially longer form journalism, literary journalism, especially for the type of photography work that goes beyond just cataloging a game and then immediately putting it up on the website. This is a struggle that all types of media outlets have faced, not just sports. The news industry, I would say, is even worse off than the sports media in this sense. And they've continued to try to find other ways to produce content without paying people. Most recently, we started to see the move toward having artificial intelligence write articles, right? We're in the beginning moment now of the AI revolution. And how is the use of AI going to transform industries? And we're already seeing it in journalism, which is that companies are going to try to have AI write articles for them. And this actually happened to Sports Illustrated. So they got called out by this tech news site Futurism for having articles, AI-generated articles that were actually published by AI-generated writers, right? So the key here is not only were they having articles written by AI, Sports Illustrated was actually creating AI people. Yeah, so so basically what the website who published the expose did, right? They found the site that sells AI generated faces, and this picture was on it. And then you can see they made a biography for Drew, right? Drew loves to be outdoors, right? He's got he loves hiking, or he just likes hanging out at his parents' farm. So really, they're trying to give him an outdoorsy, active thing. And what they had him review was like outdoor equipment, sports type of stuff. Again, they weren't even writing like news articles. They were also turning into like product reviews sort of stuff. So this kind of caused a big scandal in the moment, right? Maybe the most flagrant use of AI by a media outlet. Other media outlets have had AI write stories, but they're a little bit more upfront about it. This was one of the first examples of them trying to make a fake AI person. So eventually, they deleted all the articles that were written by their AI people. Again, we're in the very early days of this. Stuff like this is going to continue to happen. This is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. But again, kind of goes to show you where the news media industry is going, that revenues are so tight, they're looking for any ways to produce content that doesn't require investment, right? Or doesn't necessarily require the high prices that that labor does. So after this kind of failed, it eventually led to the company Maven, that had since rebranded to Arena Group, trying desperately to survive. They didn't make their quarterly payment that they're supposed to make to Authentic Brands Group to license the right to basically own Sports Illustrated. So then they got desperate and they basically laid off everyone, right? And there was a brief moment where the news reporting was Sports Illustrated is over, it's gone, it's dead. They basically fired everyone. But since they couldn't make the quarterly payment, Authentic Brands Group took back ownership, and then they sold the publishing rights again to Minute Media. And this just happened in the last month or so. Since then, Minute Media has said, we're going to try and get back a little bit to the roots of Sports Illustrated. They hired some of the people that were fired. We're still very early days in this. I don't know where Sports Illustrated's going. I'm not super confident about it. But I think its struggle speaks to the larger media landscape, right? To be, upfront about it and direct about it. It's in a very bad place for those who like to make serious journalism, invest in people who do serious journalism, whether it's through writing, photography, other means of documentary. So kind of knowing that, it makes me really appreciate the moment in time where Sports Illustrated had the resources to nurture creative talent and journalistic talent. And the work of Walter Iooss is, I think, exemplifies that, right? And really connects to what can happen when a journalistic outlet really invests in its people and provides the means to do work, to do creative work. And one thing I kind of want us to take away from this is those circumstances have dramatically changed, right? So when I look at these photos, it's not just looking at them because they're cool. To me, it's kind of looking at a previous kind of world for sports media, one that is really hard to do these days. The other thing I want to hit here is the shift in how athletes have been covered, because I think this also speaks to the unique moment of time in which these photos that are around here today have been produced. Because at the same time, kind of the power of sports journalism outlets was declining, right? And they were losing their revenue streams and losing their gravitas and losing their ability to do meaningful work. We kind of saw a rise happening at the same time of athletes starting to be able to utilize what the internet and social media offered them to control the narrative, to produce media around themselves, to actually become media companies in their own rights. So I would trace this back to around 2014-ish, right? We had the launch of Uninterrupted, right? Which was kind of a project that eventually kind of connected to LeBron James. It's still around. This was kind of a platform for athletes to speak their mind. It eventually resulted in the TV show The Shop, which people might have seen, which gets athletes and other people together to talk frankly about subjects. You can even see in kind of the title of it, Uninterrupted, it's speaking to the idea of athletes not being able to say what they feel, right? And that they get interrupted by third parties in the sports media. So this was going to be a platform for athletes to speak uninterrupted. So that was very kind of intentional with that naming device. Then we saw in 2015, just kind of or actually a little bit later in 2014, LeBron James was making his decision on where he was going to play basketball next, and it was a big deal. And he actually did it through Sports Illustrated. And this was in some ways kind of the last moment, I would argue, of Sports Illustrated having the platform big enough for a major athlete to kind of use it like this. So for those who don't know, he announced he was coming back to the Cavs. This article called I'm Coming Home. They did a whole photo shoot with it. He kind of wrote it, but he told it to one of the main writers at Sports Illustrated who kind of wrote it up for him. So it's kind of like a partnership. And that's a bit more indicative of where things were going with athletes. They weren't just being covered by sports media, they were actually kind of leading sports media, right? And it was LeBron James' camp that got this going with Sports Illustrated. They wanted to work with Sports Illustrated. They wanted to work with a specific media outlet to kind of craft his message to the community. Just a few months after this was the launch of the Players Tribune, which was founded by Yankees player Derek Jeter, among other investors. And this was a website where all the articles were ostensibly written by the athletes. I just put that in quotation marks because they often use ghostwriters and they have professional journalists who help them write their articles, but their names didn't necessarily go on the article bylines. And very quickly, the Players Tribune became a place for athletes to do these big announcements, right? So just a few months before, LeBron was going through Sports Illustrated. And then just a year or so later, when Kevin Durant was kind of the next big player who was going to announce where he was going, he announced that he was going to the Golden State Warriors. Still hate that move that happened, FYI. But he announced it through the Players Tribune, right? And again, he had a journalist who works with the Players Tribune help him write the article. But again, it gets kind of pegged to him. His ideas dominate his decisions as to how he's framed within it. So it wasn't just athletes making announcements about where they're going to play next, where they're going to go. We then started to see athletes who are currently active start to produce media as well. And the big revolution we've seen recently is active players producing content, right? So this kind of started a bit in 2016 with JJ Redick, who signed on to do the Vertical podcast through Yahoo Sports while he was an active player. Basically the first kind of athlete in a major US sport to have kind of a podcast or any type of, continual media presence during the season, right? Creating content. So he was very much a pioneer with that, and he's kind of stayed in the podcast game ever since. Nowadays, especially if you're a basketball fan, there's all types of podcasts of current players. Probably the biggest one is the Draymond Green show. Draymond Green gets into a lot of controversies, and now the news cycle goes, when he does something controversial, everyone's waiting to see what he's going to say on his podcast the next day or a few days after, right? He's been able to leverage the attention on him into views and clicks for his podcasts. But there's all types of player podcasts. Again, the NBA has been really big on this. So Paul George has a podcast. Jalen Brunson and Josh Hart of the Knicks have a podcast. Yeah, CJ McCollum has a podcast actually through ESPN. So even the big legacy media companies are also trying to partner with the athletes as well. We see it outside the NBA too, even though this is where we're seeing it the most. The Kelsey brothers, right, really got a lot of attention through their podcasts, and they've really been able to leverage their celebrity and fame through their own podcasts, right? And these are all active players who are kind of engaging in this. And then JJ Redick even brought LeBron back into it. So just in the past, I want to say month or so, they started up a new podcast called Mind the Game. Very good, I think. They really get into the wonky details of basketball. But this is, again, going on during LeBron James's career, right? The biggest star in the NBA participating in kind of a media production. We're also seeing this in documentaries. Yeah. Did anyone else watch The Last Dance during? Yeah, right. It was like it was crazy, right? It was so good, right? It was a phenomenon. It kind of took over everyone's, all the conversation, right? Because there was nothing else. We were on lockdown. A lot of us spent a lot of time watching The Last Dance, right? One thing that was interesting about this, when they showed it and they put the list of producers on The Last Dance, they actually left off Michael Jordan's name, right? He actually, through his production company, produced The Last Dance, right? Like, and for those who read the reporting on it, know this was all him, right? He controlled the rights to the footage, and for many years, he didn't let anything happen with it. The New York Times then reported that the day after LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers beat the Golden State Warriors, remember back then in 2016 when they came back from 3-1, that's when Jordan authorized making this documentary, right? So the narrative kind of goes that he kind of felt his status as the greatest player of all time was being threatened by LeBron. So he signed off on this documentary to remind everyone, right, that like he's the best, right? I love both of them. I can't decide, but that was clearly kind of what's happening, right? And ESPN, again, they left that info deliberately off that he was a producer in it, right? Because typically in documentaries, it kind of goes against journalistic ethics to have the subject be a part of it in terms of production and have final say and stuff like that. Typically, you're looking for a more independent type of viewing. But since then, we've seen this become the norm, right? The Kelsey documentary. When I teach this in my class, all my students have seen this. It kind of went wildfire among college students. They're producers on it. The NFL is also a producer on it, right? These are documentaries that are being made in concert with the people in the leagues that they're covering, right? And ostensibly, they kind of use them as promotional vehicles in that sense. The Naomi Osaka kind of miniseries on Netflix, again, she's a producer on it. She controlled the rights to the footage. She kind of set how it goes, right? Tom vs. Time, that was kind of a big deal when he released it. Tom Brady, it was his idea. He was a producer on it. So in my last 2 minutes, and I've actually gone a lot faster than I thought. What we're kind of seeing here is athletes control the media coverage of themselves, right? This has been ongoing for a while, but now it's really starting to blossom, right? They use social media to speak out on things, right? And to comment on whatever's going on, right? They have podcasts where they are doing more considered takes on a weekly basis and oftentimes through the season and commenting on various things. Whereas they're starting to get larger deals with streaming networks to produce documentaries that they control the rights to and can help shape their image, right? And they kind of have all the leverage now, right? One of the big shifts in sports media that people don't necessarily realize is the flipping of the power relationship between the journalist and the athlete, right? So when you go back to before the internet, it was the journalist who had leverage over the athlete, right? Athletes did not have vehicles to distribute what they wanted to say to people. I mean, they could put out press releases and stuff like that, but they did not have the ability to communicate in that way. And they relied on sports writers and sports journalists at papers. And particularly in major markets, there would be specific journalists who, at the biggest papers, the New York Times, the Boston Herald, who were read by millions of people, right? And those reporters had all the leverage over athletes. So when you kind of read about this back in the day, it's always interesting where athletes couldn't even really refuse to talk to a reporter, because if they did and they got on the reporter's bad side, the reporter could kind of badmouth them or talk negatively about them and kind of shape perception of them. Athletes were super dependent on reporters and being in their good graces, right? Because that's how they had their image shaped, was through journalism and reporting, which is how most people consumed the image of them and the shape of them. Over time, that has flipped. Now athletes utilize the internet, social media. They build their own media platforms. Podcasting is very easy and cheap to do, especially if you're worth $100 million. But even the more expensive things like, documentaries and stuff like that, all these streaming companies are in desperate need of content, right? And they're going to keep doing this. Sports is very popular. They're going to keep shelling out money for this. And these athletes know they can ask for full control, and they do, right? So they don't need journalists anymore to help shape their image, right? Which means that the journalist now needs the athlete, right? The journalist needs the athlete to be able to access them to create content around them. So now when in some research that's done by my friend Michael Strazia at Boston College, he interviews lots of reporters, and they talk about what it's like now to try and interview an athlete. And you basically have to fight to even get in front of them. And you have to kind of beg for access, right? Because they don't need to talk to you anymore. You have to provide value to them. So increasingly, we see larger discourses among sports journalists about whether they can really even critique athletes anymore. Because now, as a sports journalist, if you're going to say something negative about an athlete, that might be possible access that you're going to lose in the future that you need, right? So it's created this whole new dynamic where athletes are really empowered, right? And I think there's good and bad to that, right? I think it's good that athletes can help shape their images of themselves. Some of the critiques are that it can be very self-serving and very promotional, and we lose some more of the critical discourses of, what's really happening, right? So since a lot of people mentioned The Last Dance, right? Lots of criticism came out after the fact around how certain people were portrayed, right? Who thought they were portrayed unfairly to boost the image of Michael Jordan, right? And if that documentary was made by an objective third-party journalist, it might have looked a little bit different, right? And you can kind of make similar critiques about all of these things. So to kind of bring it back again to kind of the exhibition here, right? One reason that athletes, I think, really started pushing into this direction and into this arena was because their representations were very limited, right? Sports studies research, sports media research has often kind of talked about the ways in which narratives and mythologies work in sports. And typically what we find, right, is journalistic coverage of sports follows along very kind of well-trodden paths, right? You kind of get the same narratives over and over again. You get the same caricatures, right? You get the, the heroic, godly, invincible athlete like Jordan, right, who can seemingly do no wrong. You get the villains, right? You get the player who loses everything and then kind of comes back and redeems himself. Very similar in some ways to like movies and TV shows, right? And a lot of us enjoy sports through these kind of narratives, right? But what athletes have kind of long resented is that they were very hemmed in by this, right? And that oftentimes they did not get treated necessarily as multidimensional and their more human facets, right? They were often always understood as athletes and through athletic lens. This was particularly concerning when it came to athletes who engaged in activism, right? Particularly racial activism, right? Newspaper, sports journalistic coverage of Muhammad Ali, of Jim Brown, of other athletes who took a stand against racial injustice were often very negative, right? These days, we think about Ali as universally beloved, right? That is a retroactive change, right? He was by far the most controversial sports figure of all time, essentially. And the coverage of him in dominant mainstream sports journalism outlets and newspapers was often very critical of him, right? And that was often the case. So we can kind of see, similarities. In fact, people have done these kind of similar works with coverage of Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling protests in the NFL and wider arena of sports, where that coverage was often similar, right? But when it happened this time, right, in 2016, 2017, there was an alternative platform for athletes to speak out, to get their messages out. And the way in which that evolved, and I would argue the way in which the public came to be more supportive of these efforts was because of the coverage outside the mainstream media, the traditional news outlets, which was going to be a lot more conservative. So I think it's a very complex issue where I worry about the ways in which athletes are controlling the narrative and the ways they can use that for self-promotion or to be kind of uncritical or make people uncritical of them. At the same time, it can be really used to positive effect, and especially to push back on what might be unfair treatment of them by the media. So bringing this kind of home back again to the pictures is so many of Walter Iooss's pictures are of the kind of iconic sports moments, right? He was so good at capturing the form of sports, the motion of sports, these really sporty moments. And when I look at his pictures, I often start with those, right? These iconic ones. I started this whole presentation with the Dwight Clark catch over there on the side, right? One of the most famous sports moments of all time, captured in this super iconic way. But when I kind of keep looking through the photos, what really starts to stick with me, and some of my favorite ones, are the ones where he actually did show these kind of alternative sides of athletes in a way that I don't think a lot of sports photography and sports media was doing at the time, right? So in an era where the image of athletes was controlled by journalists and sports media, and often were understood through these larger tropes and narratives about athletes, and they were understood kind of solely as athletes, he had a lot of photos that I think captured the humanity of athletes, the mundane, kind of these different sides to them, even if it's just kind of slightly askew. Some of these are in the exhibition. This is one of my favorite ones, right? Yeah, Yogi Bear and Whitey Ford. Especially if you read about kind of when he takes some of these photos, he's really cool about going into his process, right? Using Polaroid cameras at times, producing a more kind of raw, intimate effect, right? Kind of using sepia tone, ways to kind of take them out of the typical glitz and glamour of how sports athletes have often been photographed, and especially kind of in the pre-internet days, right? Just random pictures of like Michael Jordan sleeping, right? Again, these just were things you not saw, and these are some of my favorite ones because I think they really show something. This one I think is just on the other side of this wall of Serena Williams, where it's almost like this is a candid picture someone snapped like on a date night or something, right? Or on a prom type of thing, right? She's looking like she's at like a social event. She's looking like a person who's not necessarily being understood as an athlete, right? He has a lot of famous pictures of Michael Jordan, some really amazing ones that really exemplify his grace and his athletic prowess. But he also has like a number of these candid ones of just him kind of looking a little bit different. I think this one's in the exhibition too, right? Arnold Palmer, I think Jack Nicklaus. All right, we talked about Ali and sort of how controversial he was. And a lot of the media representations of him often fell into this very kind of binary of the, trash talking, unbelievable athlete, one of a kind, no one like him, or this overly brash, confident, smug deserter, right, who spoke against the Vietnam War and other things like that. And this picture is one of my favorites, right? It's him as a person, right? And I think we're in a moment now where athletes are going to increasingly control how they're represented. And we're going to see lots of athletes give us peeks into themselves, right? To show us behind the scenes. We get a lot more intimate access to athletes. And I think that's good, right? But they're also kind of controlling it themselves, right? And one thing I just want to kind of impress on us is that wasn't always the case, right? And they used to be much more beholden to the photographers and the journalists who represented them. And so often those representations were really based in who they were as an athlete. And some of my favorite pictures and the things that I think are of a lot of value in this exhibition are the ones where we see them as humans. Thank you. That's all I got. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer any questions or hear from people about stuff.
So one real quick one.
Yeah.
Drew from Sports Illustrated, the AI guy.
Yeah.
What was his last name that they made up for him? And yeah,
Let's see. I can't remember.
if you look it up, like, does he exist out there? Do they, there must be stuff. If you Google, okay.
Drew Ortiz.
Yeah, I kind of thought that was weird, but
Yeah.
it sounds like he's in the Middle West and all that.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay. So they made him sort of generic or whatever.
Yeah.
His family's farm and yeah.
So what you mentioned the generic, what was interesting about this is when they found this image on the site that sells AI, right? Just like a lot of things, you can search by categories and like how they're filtered, and his category he was listed under was neutral white male. Right? Like that was, yeah. So it's like, they were looking for something that, was gonna just kind of fade into the background. No one's gonna pay too much attention to, right? Yeah, so I think even when the article, they gave it the hashtag neutral white male because they're calling attention to that. Yeah, so I think that's very observant that they were trying to find a way to just have something that blurred in there. And then as soon as they got called out, they immediately deleted everything as if that would make the issue go away. So yeah.
The other thing too, that Ali one, I mean, the composition is incredible.
Oh.
And then like sort of the use of the fence, like right side of the fence, or, his values or whatever. It's such fabulous photographs.
I know, and I mean, and I'm not trained in this, so I didn't want to speak too much to some of the things, but I mean, these are works of art, obviously, and I love them. My focus was a little bit more on putting in the context of the larger representation, but you're totally right. Like some of his photos are amazing, and there's a great selection here. But for anyone who's not familiar, you can go on his website. There's lots more there. I mean, this guy has like thousands of just amazing sports shots.
He was originally from Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think it's from Louisville. Yeah, I don't know if that's where he is in this picture. But this picture is here, right? Yeah, I think it's over there in the corner, so we can read about it. I actually don't remember what year it was done. I mean, this is obviously when he's older. There's another famous picture, which I actually meant to put in here, but didn't, but it's at the exhibition too. I don't know where it is. Yeah, him and Joe Frazier when they're both old, and it's a fantastic photo. And again, one thing with Ali, he was really reviled. So what's important to me when I think about how he is covered in the media is paying attention to who was covering him honestly as a human back then versus how people talk about him now, because everyone talks about Ali now in glowing terms, right? He lit the Olympic cauldron, right? He became a symbol of America in a way, right? If you haven't read about the history of Ali and how society treated him and the media as well, easily one of the most divisive figures during the time, right? And he became emblematic of the tension and the fight over the Vietnam War, racial justice in the US, right? And again, a lot of that media coverage was really negative. So it's really interesting for me to see people who covered him as a human, even when he didn't have kind of that legacy iconic status, right? And there were people doing that. So I think Walter Iooss should get a lot of credit for seeing the humanity in Ali, because that wasn't always a given, for sure.
I think for my time, I grew up with this. I kind of know
Mhm. Mhm.
But again, it was from my time, so it's kind of hearing you, speak of it in terms of like how he was controversial, how that shifted. That was kind of interesting. And as we were talking about that, my brain started moving, just reading a lot. I'm just kind of curious.
Mhm.
What is the story, or what is when did that shift happen? Because again, as you're talking, so we know Ali had Parkinson's. I just Googled it really quick, and that diagnosis was made in the 80s or whatever it is. And I'm curious whether or not that shift happened when that happened, because now you have this assumption. I think in terms of like fandom, right? You hate somebody because they're just so much better, and as you said, he represents America, like something that regular person you can't be, right? And the fact that he's also talking about these social issues, he does have more ammunition against them. But then when you find out that he has Parkinson's, that's almost like, oh, he's not a regular person. And he also, in a way, he banged. So I'm just curious whether when that shift happened, did it align with when his diagnosis was revealed?
Yeah. Well, you're making me want to go dive back into all the books I have on Ali, but I think it's tied into that for sure, right? So I don't want to go and say there's a specific moment where that shift happened. It was gradual in a sense, but I think the Parkinson's did it. What I would also add in there, right, is after he retired, after the Vietnam War was over, after other people came to be voices speaking out on racial inequality and stuff like that, he wasn't quite in the center of the media attention, right? And if I was being critical on this, I'd say he wasn't as dangerous, right? Because the danger from Ali came to the fact that he was extremely unafraid to call out racism in the US, right? In a way that hasn't really been replicated since, I would say. And he was really aggressive about it. And he was doing it while he was like the heavyweight champion of the world during a time, one thing we forget, boxing was as popular as any sport in America at this time, right? Who the heavyweight champion was as big a deal as who is the NBA or NFL champion. So you kind of have the most popular sports figure in a way, one of the most visible, who's at the top of his sport, right? Extremely iconic. And he's just unafraid to wade into these social issues, right? Importantly, he refused to go into Vietnam, right? And he was very clear that he wasn't going to fight for a country that oppressed him, right? And it brought to the forefront a lot of tensions over Vietnam at a time when Vietnam was extremely divisive in the US. So he was a flashpoint himself, just in terms of the larger cause with racial injustice, and he was wading into the other huge issue in the US, the Vietnam War. So he was right in the thick of it in a way that few athletes have ever been, right? But then that kind of stuff faded away over time. He was less outspoken as an activist. Vietnam obviously, wrapped up, and that wasn't on table anymore. He became more of a recluse, right? And the Parkinson's, I would say for a lot of people, humanized him in a way where it made him less dangerous, right? And I use the word dangerous there specifically because I think people saw him as dangerous back in the day when all this was going on. So again, I'm not sure if there's an exact moment I would say, but I definitely think it's the result of Parkinson's. It's a result of the issues he was speaking about. He was less vocal on them. And I think it's a way for society to kind of pat ourselves on the back, right? I think in some ways, if I'm really getting to the critical discourse of it, Ali has been used to represent that we kind of fix racism, right? Because he is heralded as someone who spoke out against racial injustice. But now if he's lighting the Olympic cauldron at the Olympics, right? In some ways it suggests that we agree with Ali, right? Or that the issues he was speaking about that were so divisive have been kind of resolved in a way. So I think if I was being really critical, I would say there's a need for us as a society to celebrate him. And I think the downside of that is it can make us kind of blind to the things that are still going on that he was very vocal about, he was hated for, that are still a major issue in the US, right? So in some ways, I think the way of which we celebrate Ali is also self-serving as a way for us to maybe marginalize the racial issues that are still going on that he spoke to.
I don't want to make it all about Ali, but when he was Cassius Clay, he was coming out with his poems and stuff, everybody loved him. And then it was the trifecta, really, he changed his religion, he spoke out politics, it was racial, so it's everything all at once.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, when, scales come the other way.
Yeah.
But then, of course, he became the father of a daughter who wanted to go into body. So you saw him as then a father, and I do think Parkinson's had a lot to do with it. That, people's sympathy reached out to him. And hopefully the United States grew up, but with tolerance and stuff. I'm not sure about that, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's hard. And I think he came to represent the ideal that I think many people want, right? And I think that's where it can get tricky, right? Is Ali as a symbol of the of the American ideal of taking a stand against injustice, right? Of the being lionized in the same way we lionize Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, other civil rights icons. He kind of gets grouped in there, right? As the best of us, right? And I think the tricky part is, we acknowledge that, but that doesn't mean that they weren't right and that these issues aren't still going on, right? So there's ways in which
shouldn't take away from their legacy, their sports records and what their achievements were in sports.
Yeah. So I mean,
they're separate.
You're right, Tree. And part of his, people loving him these days is also because of his athletic achievements, right? So, where I get a little bit worried is when Ali gets written about now, and it's not really acknowledged the depth to which he was despised by a large portion of the public, right? And that he has a very complex legacy, and he hasn't been an American hero for his entire time, right? When he was the most outspoken is when he was not seen as an American hero by a lot of people. So if we're going to make him an American hero now, we need to recognize the challenges he faced and the reception he received from people on issues that are still, we're still dealing with a lot of the same stuff, right? If you go back and look at him speak about race in the US, we can find the same stuff going on, right? Like we haven't fixed what he was mad about and what people were mad at him about, right? So if we are celebrating him, but these issues still exist, we need to find a way to kind of keep both those thoughts at the same time. Yeah.
I just have we're also live streaming this on Zoom, so
Sure.
there's a question that came in. We believe there's two questions, so feel free to answer either. We believe that museums are where balance and discourse can really flourish. Do you see how any of that shifts? You just mentioned about sports media discourse may make a space for that. Also, where do you think sports photography is headed, given the shift in the journalist-athlete relationship and power dynamic? And I know we only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, so I'll try not to ramble on too much. I think the photography thing is interesting because I think everyone has phones now. We see moments of sport. We see so many different angles now that we are almost capturing sport more than ever, right? And if there's any big moment in sports, I don't know if anyone else does this. I'll look for YouTube clips or whatever of people who are at the game who post videos of it. I look for all the different angles they have from the feeds, right? We're capturing in all these ways, but it's increasingly become a little bit more highlight driven, right? It's almost like here's just a video of the crazy play, and you watch it from a lot of different angles. And we're not seeing as much of what I would say, the more creative, the more artistic stuff, right? I actually spent some time yesterday trying to find, really great pictures that I would say are comparable quality to these from recent years. And there's not a lot, right? There's some great photographers out there. One, let me pull him up because he's got good stuff. I was spending some time on his stuff. Jed Jacobson, right, who did the photo for Kevin Durant. He does a lot of great photos, but they're very functional, right? They are more serving the desire to document the game. He just has a lot of skill, and that kind of comes across. Maybe he's taking other pictures that he's just not posting. I was just on his Instagram, so I can't speak to his full body of work. But I think that's kind of where it's headed, is that we're much more focused on capturing these iconic moments, but in a much more kind of documentary style way. I don't know if there is going to be spaces for more creative aspects or where that could come from. I will say the sports media industry is in a big amount of flux, and we are starting to see some different approaches to it. So one of the ones that I would probably mention is the website, The Defector, which was actually created by all the people who got fired from Deadspin when another entity came in and basically shut it down. That's a long story. I can't get into that. But they went off and started their own website called The Defector. That's employee run, and they sell subscriptions to it. They're trying to make it sustainable by the people who run it, and they're trying to take a different approach to it, and they've been successful. So I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if we start to see more boutique websites that are trying to serve different representations of sports. I think it is an uphill battle, but I do think there is a space for that. We're starting to see some shift toward that.
I just, in the interest of time, I know we have one more question.
Yeah, I'll hang around if anyone wants to
But,
come and ask me
I
questions.
just want to thank Dr. Rugg, and then if you have a question, you can maybe ask after, if that's okay.
Sure.
But just thank you so much, and if you have a round of applause.
Thank you for having me. Really good.
Feel free to grab a sandwich if you didn't have one earlier. Thank you so much for coming.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, what's up with you?
I have a question I will ask. Sports.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something that I face a lot. So I have students who come in who want to know.
Yes. So Velma, Siobhan, are you? There's two more pretty.